أهلا بكم في هذه المقابلة الخاصة. لعقود عرف الشرق الأوسط على أنه منطقة على خط الزلازل الأمنية والسياسية. هنا دوما تتشابك الملفات والرؤى في غالبيتها ضبابية، لذلك دائما هناك حاجة لتفسيرات مختلفة معمقة وواقعية كذلك. ضيف هذه المقابلة وصف نفسه ذات مرة بأنه ليس متفائلا ولا متشائما، بل إنه رجل واقعي. واقعية طبعا اكتسبها مما يقرب من 4 عقود قضاها في المناصب العسكرية والحكومية رفيعة المستوى، كقيادة القيادة المركزية الأمريكية والقوة متعددة الجنسيات في العراق، وصولا إلى مدير وكالة المخابرات المركزية الأمريكية. خبرات عسكرية واستراتيجية متعددة لخصها في كتاباته وأبحاثه الكثيرة، آخرها الكتاب الأكثر مبيعا طبقا لنيويورك تايمز: الصراع، تطور الحرب منذ عام 1945 وحتى الحرب في أوكرانيا. الجنرال ديفيد بتريوس مدير وكالة المخابرات المركزية السابق. جنرال بتريوس، أهلا بك معنا في هذه المقابلة الخاصة على شاشة العربية. جنرال بتريوس، دعني أبدأ من تصريحاتك الأخيرة. اعتبرت في هذه التصريحات بأن الحرب الشاملة بين إسرائيل وإيران غير مرجحة بسبب المخاوف من الدمار المحتمل لكلا البلدين، لكن السؤال: هل ترى بأن هذا سبب كافي لعدم توسع الحرب بين إسرائيل وإيران، خاصة بأنه هناك تصريحات كثيرة في إسرائيل تقول بأن تل أبيب تسعى لاستغلال الوقت الحالي لتوجيه ضربة لإيران قبل حصولها على أي أسلحة نووية؟
No, I do stand by that. But full-scale war between Iran and Israel, and also involving Lebanese Hezbollah and perhaps some of the other Iranian-supported militias in Iraq, the Houthis, of course, Hamas. It's not impossible. I did say when I was commanding the surge in Iraq that I was neither an optimist nor a pessimist, but a realist. And then I added that the reality is in Iraq and the Middle East that it's all hard all the time, but hard is not hopeless. In this case, I do think that Iran and Israel and Hezbollah have worked their way through the damage that either side could do to the other and realize that full-scale war would bring an enormous amount of death and destruction. Could Israel indeed do enormous damage to Iran and also, of course, to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon? Yes, absolutely. But each of those countries has considerable capacity. Each of those entities, Hezbollah, obviously not a country, but Hezbollah does have over 130 or 1,000 or so missiles, rockets, and so forth, some of them with large warheads and considerable accuracy. And if enough of these are launched at one time, they could likely overwhelm the very sophisticated layer air and ballistic missile defense of Israel. And there would be considerable damage and destruction. Certainly Israel will do even more to Hezbollah, but again, damage and destruction on both sides. And the same would be the case with Iran. I think right now what each of the parties is doing is waiting to see if there might be a ceasefire reached in the ongoing negotiations. Of course, the U.S. Secretary of State is in the region. Negotiations reportedly are taking place today in Doha, Qatar. I think unlikely that we'll get an agreement in the next days or so, but I don't think it's impossible that an agreement could be reached in the next few weeks. That probably would be in the interests of all the different parties. Iran in particular, I think, with a new administration that was hoping to reach out to the Western world instead of going to war with Israel, I think is particularly hopeful that a ceasefire could provide an excuse, if you will, for them not to have to carry out some major escalation of the conflict between Iran and Israel that would result in a major escalation in Israel's response.
طيب جنرال بتريوس، أنت ذكرت بأنه إيران سوف تكون مجبرة على الرد بسبب الضربة التي اعتبرت أنها وجهت لشرفها الوطني بعد طبعا اغتيال إسماعيل هنية في طهران، لكن كيف تعتقد ستكون طبيعة الرد الإيراني برأيك؟ هل سنكون أمام رد منفرد أم متزامن مع ميليشيات إيران في المنطقة، في لبنان، في العراق، في اليمن، أم رد استخباراتي وليس عسكري؟
I suspect the decision has actually not been made. I'm sure there are different factions within the regime and the Iranian government that are arguing for different types of responses. And again, you have a brand new president, you have a brand new cabinet. They're still just getting established. Obviously, the real decision making, the real power rests with the supreme leader and others right around him. But again, I think they're very likely considering a number of different options and also recognizing what Israel's response would be to each of those different courses of action. And I suspect, again, no final decision has been made, in part because they're also waiting to see what happens with the negotiations around a ceasefire with Hamas.
طيب أنت ذكرت بأن أجهزة الاستخبارات الإسرائيلية أثبتت مرة أخرى على مدى إتقانها لاختراق عناصر مختلفة في الداخل الإيراني، لكن يعني مؤخرا إسرائيل وجهت ضربات في اليمن، في لبنان، في الداخل الإيراني عسكرية واستخباراتية كذلك، لكن السؤال هل استطاعت تل أبيب استعادة الردع الذي فقدت جزء كبير منه بعد أحداث 7 أكتوبر؟
Well, that was a truly traumatic event. I'm not sure that in America we fully understand and appreciate just how significant it was. Keep in mind that we lost nearly 3,000 individuals in the 9/11 attacks. The equivalent of what Israel sustained for the United States would be 40,000 killed and 7,000 taken hostage. And of course, the way that this attack was carried out, the brutality, the inhumanity, the barbarity, filming it, rape, and so forth, were all absolutely just unconscionable. And again, it has inflicted a trauma on the Israeli people. It's the worst day in their history. And they obviously are still hard at work trying to achieve the original stated objectives were to destroy Hamas and to ensure that it never governs Gaza again, and also obviously to get their hostages back. Each of those is still a work in progress. Hamas has been significantly, very substantially degraded. The fact that Israel now controls the Philadelphia corridor, the border between Gaza territory and Egypt and the Rafah crossing is a very significant achievement for them because they now control access completely to Gaza. It's much more difficult for Hamas to reconstitute itself when it comes to weapon systems, ammunition, explosives, and so forth. But they do continue to reconstitute themselves in terms of personnel because Israel is conducting clear and leave operations, essentially raids into Gaza and then generally pulling back out. And Hamas is able to reconstitute. And of course, there's a lack of security inside Gaza right now, which means that it's very, very difficult to, in an organized fashion, provide humanitarian assistance, restore basic services, begin reconstruction, and so forth. All of that really requires security. And the current strategy does not appear that it is going to be able to achieve that. So that is a challenge that they have. And also, again, in terms of governance of Hamas, we still don't see the kind of political end state that the Minister of Defense of Israel and former Minister Benny Gantz and others have called for. That still has not been laid out. And I agree with them that that is much needed. And then obviously the ceasefire negotiations, a primary objective of that for Israel's side is, of course, to get the remaining hostages back, noting that 6 more bodies were recovered in the last 24 to 36 hours by the Israeli Defense Forces. So there's still a great deal of work to be done there. And there are a lot of unknowns there as to what, again, the political end state inside Gaza will be. And without security, if you truly don't control that, then again, providing humanitarian assistance and so forth is extraordinarily challenging. Hamas and criminal elements are essentially still the guys with guns, if you will, the authorities, such as there is any, inside the territory, and very difficult. No Arab countries are going to go in there in a situation like that. International organizations find it very difficult to operate. And of course, you're not going to be able to bring in other Palestinian security forces because they don't want to get into it with Hamas. So again, a very challenging situation, one that is still not complete. It's still very much a work in progress. And the vision for which has still not yet been provided.
طيب على يعني تعقيبا طبعا على كل ما قلته جنرال بتريوس، أنت كان يعني لك تعقيب سابق في هذه المسألة، وقلت بأنه تجربتك الشخصية في إدارة الجيوش المنخرطة في حملات مكافحة التمرد يجب أن تكون بمثابة تحذير للجيش الإسرائيلي في حالة أنه يمضي قدما في التوغل البري، وأن هذه العمليات عادة ربما تستغرق عقد من الزمن أو أكثر كما رأينا في العراق أو في أفغانستان. هل تعتقد بالفعل بأن الجيش الإسرائيلي ربما يحتاج لعقد من الزمن لعمليات في غزة؟
Well, it depends on the effectiveness of the security operations. Again, Hamas has been dramatically degraded. There's no way they can conduct the kind of attacks that they conducted in the past. Hamas is a shadow of itself when it comes to military capacity, but it still exists. And it is being reconstituted in terms of its personnel, at least. There's Hamas 2.0 being formed. The sooner that Israel commits to truly securing it, creating, if you will, gated communities, such as we did within Fallujah, Ramadi, Bakuba, noting that Gaza is more difficult, fiendishly more difficult, because of the underground tunnel system of over 350 miles worth than all of those that we did during the surge in Iraq put together. But the only long-term solution possible would rest on the achievement of security. Once you have security, then you can bring in international organizations, and you can bring in Palestinian security forces from the West Bank that say the U.S. will train, perhaps oversee. You can bring in non-governmental organizations. Arab forces will come in then. Contractors can be used to augment the Israeli Defense Forces and so forth. But that vision has not been laid out, despite, again, Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant and former Minister Benny Gantz calling for something along those lines, at least laying out what the long-term vision is for Gaza. It's very premature to say whether this is a decade, years, months, what have you. It certainly will be years. Given the extraordinary amount of work that has to be done, not just in a military and security sense, but in a civilian sense, in terms of the restoration of basic services, reconstruction, schools, markets, clinics, roads, houses, bridges, and so forth, and really overhauling every aspect of the education system and other social elements inside Gaza that Hamas so perverted during its time in charge of the territory.
طيب جنرال بتريوس، دعني أذهب معك الآن نذهب إلى الماضي، ويعني جزء من هذا الحديث سيعتمد طبعا على الكتاب الأخير لك، وهو الصراع تطور الحرب منذ عام 1945 وحتى الحرب في أوكرانيا، الكتاب الأكثر مبيعا طبقا لنيويورك تايمز. سنبدأ بأفغانستان. في أفغانستان قلت أنه العملية التي عرفت باسم الحرية الدائمة، وهي الإطاحة بطالبان وتدمير تنظيم القاعدة، وأنه بعد هذه أو تحقيق هذه الأهداف سوف تركز إدارة بوش على استقرار أفغانستان وإنشاء مجتمع حر يحكمه حكومة منتخبة ديمقراطيا. بعد كل هذه السنوات، هل تحقق أي شيء من هذه الأهداف التي وضعتها الولايات المتحدة برأيك؟
Well, it was achieved for 20 years. It was certainly imperfect. Aspects of it were maddening. Our partners were frustrating. There was corruption. There were innumerable challenges. But I would submit that the population, the vast majority of the population in Afghanistan, was in a vastly better situation when we were still on the ground with a modest number of forces, having not even lost a soldier in the final year and a half we were there until the terrible suicide bombing at Abbey Gate at the airport. We didn't have to withdraw. We easily could have sustained what it was we were doing. All of our coalition partners wanted to stay, but our withdrawal led to what was inevitable, which was a collapse of the Afghan security forces when the operational readiness of the linchpin of that defense strategy, which was the helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft that transported the 35,000 strong commando force to reinforce and augment security forces that were under attack by Taliban around the country. And I think that that was tragic. I think that what we see in Afghanistan now is an ultra-conservative 9th century interpretation of Islam. Half the population can't go to high school or college. That same half can't participate particularly meaningfully in society or the economy outside the house, and half the population is starving. So again, I think the situation as we see it is exceedingly dire. Millions and millions of Afghans have voted with their feet and left the country, and we could have stayed. So what was set out to be achieved, I think a fair amount of that was achieved. There were peaceful transitions of power, however long they took and however much the argument over that. The same, frankly, in Iraq, where there have been numerous peaceful transitions of power. One took, to be sure, 9 months, but a country that in many respects right now, economically, is doing very well. Albeit not as well as it should, given that it's one of the top 5 oil exporters in the world, and yet still can't completely provide 24-hour electricity power to its people. But coming along,
طيب
and if
يعني
it can
سنأتي
avoid the
للحديث عن العراق
objective of
جنرال
Iran, which
بتريوس.
is to Lebanonize Iraq, to achieve in Iraq what they've achieved in Lebanon with a powerful militia on the streets and political power in the parliament. If it can avoid that, and I think that the majority of Iraqi parliamentarians do want to avoid that, I think there are good prospects for Iraq. Again, however imperfect that outcome may be as well.
طيب بكل تأكيد سنأتي على العراق، لأنه يعني أنت خصصت لها فصل كامل في الكتاب، لكن يعني بالنظر إلى أفغانستان قبل أيام طبعا بكل تأكيد تابعت العرض العسكري الذي أقامته حركة طالبان، ويعني ظهر جليا في هذا العرض مروحيات أمريكية ومدرعات كذلك أمريكية وأسلحة أمريكية بأيدي طالبان الآن في أفغانستان. ألا تعتقد حصول حركة طالبان على مثل هذه الأسلحة يشكل خطر على الأمن العالمي أو حتى على أمن الولايات المتحدة، إن لم يكن الآن ففي المستقبل؟
No, I don't actually. I think that was a nice parade. But again, it poses no threat. It does pose a threat to its neighbors in that it has not controlled its territory sufficiently to prevent the growth of the Islamic State Khorasan group, which of course carried out the attack in Moscow, showing that it has the ability to carry out attacks well beyond the borders of Afghanistan and the region described as Khorasan. It also has not been able to keep the Tariqi Taliban Pakistani, the Pakistani Taliban, from establishing sanctuaries in the mountainous regions near the border, if you will, the Duran line between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And of course, it is a failed state in a number of different respects, which means that it's a burden on its neighbors with huge numbers of refugees in Pakistan, others in some of the other countries that surround it, including Iran. But I don't at all see it as a threat to the United States, except in as much as it is incapable of keeping the Islamic State from developing its ability to carry out extremist attacks beyond the actual region and all the way again into Moscow and perhaps all the way into Europe at some point. And that is worrisome.
طيب اسمح لي جنرال بتريوس أن نتوقف مع فاصل قصير ثم نتابع هذه المقابلة. فاصل قصير ونعود. أهلا بكم من جديد في هذه المقابلة الخاصة مع الجنرال ديفيد بتريوس مدير وكالة المخابرات المركزية السابق. أهلا بك جنرال بتريوس مجددا. دعنا نذهب إلى العراق. كنت متلهفا للحديث عن العراق وخصصت لها فصلا كاملا في الكتاب. يعني بالتاريخ، بالعودة للتاريخ، أنت انتقدت سلطة التحالف المؤقتة بقيادة السفير الأمريكي السابق بول بريمر، واعتبرت أنه كان يفتقر إلى أي معرفة كبيرة بالعراق أو بالشرق الأوسط، وأنه خيار مؤسف لهذه الوظيفة. إلى أي مدى ساهم اختيار بول بريمر في العراق في فشل ما خططت له الولايات المتحدة في هذه الفترة؟
Well, first of all, I would submit that we didn't fail to achieve our objectives in Iraq, although the decisions by Ambassador Bremer shortly after he arrived and assumed the role as the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority were absolutely catastrophic. And I should just note here that I served in Iraq, of course, as a two-star general, as part of the invasion commander of the 101st Airborne Division, the Firqimiyat Wahid. then came back shortly after that year, did another 15 months as the head of the train and equip mission as a 3-star, then home for a year, and then came back to command the surge in Iraq for 19 and a half months as a 4-star, then was at Central Command, so still overseeing Iraq and all of the greater Middle East, and eventually the CIA director when we withdrew our final combat forces from Iraq in late 2011. So this is a country with which I have had a lot of experience. I have often said Ana Iraqi, Ana Maslawi, because this is where I spent the first year of the war after the fight to Baghdad. Ana Shamari, that was the tribe, which I liked because they had Shia as well as Sunni in it. But look, I think eventually, by the end of 2011, Iraq was actually in a very good place. But it took the surge in Iraq, it took a commitment to reconciliation to remedy what Bremer had actually done all the way back in the spring of 2003, when in a disastrous series of decisions and policies, he decided to fire the entire Iraqi military without telling them how we would enable them to provide for themselves and their families. And then he compounded that by firing the Ba'ath Party, Saddam's party to be sure, and the first 2 levels of that certainly should have been cast out of Iraq and those individuals actually detained. But when you got down to level 4, this was tens of thousands of bureaucrats, many of them Western educated, precisely the people we needed to help us run a country, which we did not sufficiently understand. And he fired them without an agreed reconciliation process, and that was the real flaw. So there was no redress for them. They were just out. And as you would appreciate as a fellow Iraqi, every job in Iraq at that time was a government job. Every university was owned, paid for by the government, every major industry, just about everything, with the exception of a few minor little shops, was controlled by the government in some fashion. And so to throw everyone out of an opportunity for a government job was absolutely catastrophic. And again, it was not remedied until during the surge in Iraq, when I instituted a reconciliation process to remedy that situation.
طيب، لكن جنرال بتريوس، يعني أنت قلت بأن الرئيس بوش كان يأمل في أن يرى العراق بمثابة كوريا الجنوبية في الشرق الأوسط، حليف إقليمي للولايات المتحدة، تتمتع بحكومة ديمقراطية وباقتصاد حر. هل العراق اليوم يعني مشابه إلى كوريا الجنوبية أو قريب حتى من كوريا الجنوبية برأيك؟ لأنه البعض يقول بأنه أنتم سلمتم العراق في نهاية المطاف إلى إيران.
Well, there's no question that Iran was one of the big, if not the biggest winners of this. Obviously, a minority Sunni kleptocratic dictator was deposed who controlled a Shia majority country. And naturally, you're going to have a Shia political leader if you have a democratically elected government. So I think that's indisputable. And I always thought the idea of turning it into South Korea in a couple of decades was wholly unrealistic. That doesn't mean, however, that there were not significant achievements in Iraq. And if Iraq can navigate this very challenging period right now, where, as I mentioned earlier, you have their large neighbor to the east trying to turn them into Lebanon by controlling the parliament and having a powerful militia on the streets, if they can avoid that, I think they can actually have a reasonably bright future. And I'm still somewhat optimistic, actually, about the Balad of Rafidain, the land of the 2 rivers.
طيب، فيما يتعلق بالشرق الأوسط جنرال بتريوس، أنت يعني كان لك تعليق في هذه المسألة، وصفت جهود الولايات المتحدة لمغادرة الشرق الأوسط بمحاولة مايكل كورليوني بمغادرة المافيا. لا يوجد فقط طريق سوى المزيد من الانخراط في الداخل. لكن هنا دائما يرى البعض بأن الولايات المتحدة بالفعل تعزز من وجودها بشكل كبير في المنطقة، لكن هذا التعزيز لا يراعي مصالح الدول المعتدلة في المنطقة، وأن واشنطن بشكل كبير لم تعد تستمع لآراء حلفائها، وبالتالي هي تعالج الأخطاء بالمزيد من الأخطاء أحيانا.
Yeah, I just don't agree with that. Again, we have been far from perfect over the decades. I was there over the decades and watched this very closely inside the Middle East and from the outside. Again, we've had missteps. We've also had successes. I think that we do listen carefully. I think not as carefully as we might have at various times. But I think the involvement in the region right now is very, very substantial. My argument has not been that you have to go deeper. My argument has been that you should not continually try to leave and tell the countries in the region that you're trying to leave to focus completely on the Indo-Pacific. Instead, we need to recognize we need to maintain a consistent presence, a consistent commitment, and indeed ensure we know who our enemies are and who our friends are. Iran is our enemy. Gulf states, Israel are our friends. And never confuse the two. Recognize there may be differences of opinion at times, but our overall objectives are consistent and aligned, and continue in that kind of approach with a stable, solid presence, and providing our partners and allies with as much as we possibly can when they ask for it.
جنرال ديفيد بتريوس مدير وكالة المخابرات المركزية السابق، شكرا جزيلا على كل ما تفضلت به من توضيحات في هذه المقابلة. شكرا على وجودك معنا.
عفوا، شكرا جزيلا.
أعزائي المشاهدين، كذلك هنا تنتهي هذه المقابلة الخاصة مع الجنرال ديفيد بتريوس مدير وكالة المخابرات المركزية السابق. في أمان الله.